When most people think about the Game Boy Advance, they imagine colourful platformers, RPGs or 2D classics. What you don't often picture is full 3D racing. But between 2003 and 2006, EA brought Need for Speed to the Game Boy Advance in not one, not two, but 5 different entries, all running in 3D, squeezed onto a handheld barely more powerful than a Super Nintendo. Today we're going to look back at all 5 Game Boy Advance Need for Speed games in release order to see how they pulled off the impossible and how they stand as a strange, overlooked chapter in the series. So the first of these 5, and arguably the roughest, is Need for Speed Underground. This was developed by the Pocketeers, specifically this version, and it was released in December 2003 or January 2004 depending on where you lived in the world. Now every other version of the game came out in November, but specifically the Game Boy Advance version released later on due to being developed by, well, someone else. So Underground was the game that pushed the series into tuner culture and street racing. So to be honest, this game is as faithful to the console version as it possibly could be on a Game Boy Advance. You've got the 3D visuals, the street races, some semi-decent customization, and considering the graphical capabilities of the Game Boy Advance, you could actually see that customization somewhat okay. It featured music from the licensed soundtrack of the home console version, although it doesn't sound that great on a Game Boy Advance speaker, and they just loop Get Low on repeat over and over on the menus, and it's in this terrible audio quality so it gets quite annoying. In races, visually it's very blurry, it's hard to see what's coming up, and obviously due to the limitations, the physics are quite simplified, there's quite a bit of pop-in. I don't know, I shouldn't complain because the very fact that this is in 3D and running on the console is very impressive. I have a massive soft spot for 3D games on the Game Boy Advance because no matter how bad they look, it's still a technical achievement that it exists to begin with. So sure, the neon-lit atmosphere of the console version was stripped back, but you still got the street night racing, career progression, and car unlocks. So for 2003, that's pretty damn good. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly set the stage for what handheld Need for Speed could be. Now, as I'm sure you probably know, there was a very positive reception to the home console version of Underground. And whilst the Game Boy Advance port didn't reach the high review scores of the home console version, it still sits a generally favourable 77 out of 100 on Metacritic, which is incredibly impressive. So the home console versions of the game went on across all platforms to ship about 15 million units, which is incredibly impressive. Now the Game Boy Advance version was obviously never going to hit these heights, but it still shifted a semi-okay 300,000 copies. So fair play to Pocketeers, this is a good start and a push in the right direction, even if the game isn't exactly perfect. So weirdly enough, just a few months later, we then get a port of Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed for the Game Boy Advance, which is odd because the home console and PC version launched in 2000. But here we are 4 years later with a random Game Boy Advance port from the same developers, Pocketeers. Now Underground as a game has a much bigger scope than Porsche Unleashed ever did, but I think that works in its favour, because Porsche Unleashed on the GBA is a much more streamlined experience. So of course every car in the game was a Porsche, spanning decades of their history. You had a proper career mode and a decent number of tracks. The engine they used here looked a little sharper than it did in Underground, though it was still limited by short draw distance and some iffy frame drops. However, this was the first and only game on the Game Boy Advance in this series to have a first-person driving perspective. Does it look amazing? I mean, not particularly, but it's really cool and the fact it works is just very cool to me. The handling felt a little less floaty than it did in Underground, although it was still quite pedantic. Sometimes steering feels really tight, sometimes it feels like you're on ice, and there tends to be no in between. However, they had increased the AI difficulty in this game because in Underground they were excruciatingly easy, whereas here, the further you progressed, the harder they actually became. Just on a side note, this is the first in the Game Boy Advance series of Need for Speed games that has retro achievements. So the first Underground doesn't, but every game from Porsche Unleashed does, so if you're interested in completionist achievements, go check those out. Anyway, the narrower car selection does mean it lacked variety a little, but if you're a Porsche enthusiast, you're kind of in for a treat here. For handheld fans, it showed that the Game Boy Advance could deliver something closer to a serious racing experience, even if the game wasn't as polished as its console cousins. Now, in terms of review scores, Porsche Unleashed actually has a much lower score than Underground on Metacritic. It currently holds a 62 out of 100, putting it into the mixed or average realm. Most of the complaints from what I've read of these reviews seems to be about the lack of content and the lack of car selection, which I guess just makes sense because they decided to port this game after they just ported Need for Speed Underground. A bit of a bizarre choice. If anything, they should have done this first. Anyway, those review scores didn't really seem to put people off because this game sold better than Underground did on the Game Boy Advance, with just under 500,000 units shifted, which is pretty good considering the original PlayStation 1 version sold 700,000 copies. These stats are all from VG Charts. So, following on from that weird port of Porsche Unleashed, EA doubled down on 3D street racing with Need for Speed Underground 2. The GBA version managed to squeeze in more cars, more event types, and better looking environments. So this released in November of 2004 and was once again developed by Pocketeers, who had also now worked on a Nintendo DS version which would launch the following year. The handling, again, while somewhat improved, was still a bit iffy, but certainly less floaty than it was in the original Underground. Visually, I would say this is probably the best looking Need for Speed game on the console, because really it's the only game in this series on the Game Boy Advance that I didn't struggle so much to actually see what was going on. Another cool inclusion of this port was the addition of some minigames. They weren't particularly good or exciting, but it's nice to have some minigames in my Nintendo console games. One of them is where you have to tune your engine, and all you have to do is hold A and hold B to keep the dot in the middle of the screen, and that's all there is to it. But you know what? I'll take the extra content. Now, of course, this is an Underground game, so the customization is back in its full glory, and it's still somewhat in-depth considering it's a GBA title. In terms of performance, it certainly pushed the hardware hard, sometimes even to its breaking point. Frame rate dips were a bit more common in this one, but I would imagine if you were a player in 2004, seeing Underground 2 running in 3D on this console was probably worth it. Now, in terms of critical response, it fared slightly better than Porsche Unleashed, but still worse than the original Underground, holding a 72% out of 100 on Metacritic. Reviews were really varied, with some highs of 80s with some lows of 35 complaining about the lack of detail. Now, overall, across all its home console versions, Need for Speed Underground 2 would go on to shift about 11 million copies. Not quite as high as the original Underground, but still very, very impressive. So the Game Boy Advance version would go on to shift about 400,000 copies, which is still not bad, considering this was nearing the end of the Game Boy Advance's lifespan. And even though we are nearing the end of the GBA's lifespan, we've still got 2 more games to talk about, so let's move on to Most Wanted. So November 2005 brought with it Need for Speed Most Wanted. Now, I've actually covered both other handheld versions of this game on the channel before, both in the Worst Racing Games series, so that's Most Wanted 510 on the PSP, which is just, it's not great, it's not terrible, and Most Wanted on the DS, which is quite possibly one of the worst racing games I've ever played. However, I'm pleased to announce that Pocketeers somehow made a better Need for Speed Most Wanted port on the Game Boy than other developers did on the DS. Now, by this point, this was the Pocketeers' 4th attempt at Need for Speed on the Game Boy Advance, so visually, you know what you're getting at this point. They kind of refined it, but at the end of the day, it's still on this console, so it's never ever going to look that good. However, it somehow kept most of the charm and personality of the home console versions. The blacklist system made the cut so you could work your way through rival racers, climbing the ladder to the top. Races were varied, you actually had police in the game, and to be fair, there was somewhat more of a sense of speed than there were in previous entries. Again, it still had frame rate issues, and visually it was kinda hard to navigate, but in all fairness to Pocketeers, they still did a damn good job. Now of course, EA must have wanted a lot of money because this game got ported to pretty much every platform at the time. But to me, it does beg the question, why did they bother with this one? Because the PSP and DS had already come out at this point, so why did we need a Game Boy Advance port? And I know people had the previous platform, but we've already had 3 previous titles that all function pretty much exactly the same. We don't need another one. Or maybe I'm just a grumpy old man, who knows. Now in terms of critical response, by this point less and less firms were reviewing Game Boy Advance games because this one only has 2 critic reviews, so it doesn't even have an official Metascore. But those 2 reviews were 50 out of 100 and 62 out of 100, so it would just be in the mixed or average realm once again. Thankfully, at least it reviewed better than the DS port at 45. Now, as I'm sure you know, Need for Speed Most Wanted was one of the best-selling games in the series, with 17 million units shifted. And I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise when I tell you that the Game Boy Advance sales made up basically none of that, as they only shifted about 200,000 copies. And I'm sure we'll continue to see that trend when we move on to our next game, Need for Speed Carbon. So the team at Pocketeers got to have one final crack at porting the Need for Speed series to the Game Boy Advance with Need for Speed Carbon Own the City. Now, Own the City is one of the more underrated games on the PSP, but how does it function here on the Game Boy? Well, visually, I'm gonna be honest, it's probably one of the worst looking ones on the console. The colours are just too bright and sometimes it's hard to actually see anything. The whole game is just too bright in general. However, on the other hand, there are some welcome additions such as a minimap on screen which allowed me to better compensate for upcoming corners, rather than just kind of guessing based on the muddy visuals. I'm not quite sure why it took 5 games to get to a point where we had a minimap, but hey, at least it's here. Now, Own the City has a reputation for having one of the wildest stories in a racing game ever, that involves your brother getting killed, you getting amnesia, and then basically figuring out that you're the one that got him killed. The whole thing is just crazy, and I'm really glad that the story is still here on the Game Boy Advance. Now, Own the City on the PSP was also notable for having free roam, but sadly, and of course really, the DS and Game Boy Advance versions never got that feature. The crew mechanic from the game was also ported here, but to be honest, it doesn't work very well. You can get your teammates to draft you to attack other opponents, but they just kind of crash into you or crash into walls. It's nice that they try to implement it, but it just doesn't work at all. I tried to get drafted a few times, and every single time my teammate would just run into the back of me. And another weird thing that I did notice is that the teammates don't actually count in terms of the positions in the race. So races have 4 cars, but only 3 of them count in positions because one of them is your teammate. So even if I was in front of my teammate, I would still be in position 3 of 3 because for whatever reason, even though they're racing too, they don't count. Very weird. So yeah, this game wasn't revolutionary, but as the Game Boy Advance's last lap in the series, Carbon was still a decent send-off, even if the visuals just weren't that great. Now, in terms of critical response, the Game Boy Advance port of Carbon actually fared quite well compared to some of its predecessors. It only has 2 reviews, with one review giving it 70 out of 100 and another giving it 85 out of 100, which would certainly put it on the higher end in terms of these games. Which is weird because this is one of those that I actually enjoyed less than Porsche Unleashed and Underground 2. Now, Carbon across the board would go on to shift just under 16 million units, which is very impressive, but sadly we don't have any sales figures at all for specifically the Game Boy Advance version, which is a shame, but I'm gonna guess based on the fact this came out in 2006, which was already a year or so into the DS and PSP lifespans, this probably didn't sell very well. So looking back, these 5 Game Boy Advance Need for Speed games are an amazing example of developers pushing hardware past its limits. They weren't perfect, draw distance, pop-in, and frame drops were constant reminders of the console's limits. But for kids who grew up playing these on the bus or under the covers at night, they were probably nothing short of magical. In the grand scope of Need for Speed, the GBA games are an overlooked side road, but one that personally I think is worth revisiting. And so that takes us to the end of our look at the Need for Speed games on the Game Boy Advance. These are certainly weirder than their console counterparts, but overall still a pretty fun time. What do you think of these games? Did you play any of them? Do you have a favourite? Please let me know in the comments down below. And if there's any other weird console ports you want to see me tackle, pop that in the comments as well. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive thanks to my Patreons for the support, and there's only one thing left to say. I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.